Look at the geographical data. A domestic infection heat map of the 1970s is entirely blank. Then, without warning, a violent crimson stain erupts on the Connecticut coastline, spreading outward with absolute mathematical precision. Overlay this zone with a heavily redacted 1954 Department of Defense protocol authorizing the mass breeding of infected arthropods. The exact geographical center of this biological explosion sits precisely 2.5 miles from a military base. Here is the hard evidence of the current threat. Over 400,000 Americans contract this disease annually. If you live in the Northeast or the Midwest, a simple walk in the woods exposes you to a pathogen whose origins remain actively obscured by state secrecy. Your ignorance of this paper trail leaves you highly vulnerable. You are facing an illness that the medical establishment frequently misdiagnoses simply because they are operating with deliberately incomplete origin data. We are going to bypass the sanitized public relations statements of the government. By utilizing open-source intelligence, newly declassified entomological warfare blueprints, and recent advances in paleogenetic sequencing, we will reconstruct the exact chain of custody of this pathogen. We are treating this not as a medical mystery, but as a crime scene. I will walk you through the archive line by line to expose the true patient zero of a manufactured, engineered epidemic. The crime scene is established on a quiet, affluent suburban street in Lyme, Connecticut, in 1975. A mother sits at a kitchen table, meticulously circling dates on a calendar, tracking a phantom illness. Outside, the true suspect waits. A black-legged tick crawls up a blade of grass, feeling the air for the carbon dioxide of a host. It is the ultimate contrast between domestic safety and a microscopic predator. The official record states that in the summer of 1975, a bizarre medical anomaly was logged in the adjacent towns of Lyme and Old Lyme. Before this date, the medical archives of the region showed absolutely no history of this specific pathology. It was a blank slate. Then, the protocols began to fill with reports of a crippling, localized affliction. As an investigator reviewing the historical timeline, this sudden, synchronized onset is your first major red flag. The raw statistics of the incident defied all established medical literature. 39 children and 12 adults were suddenly diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis within the exact same tight geographical cluster. To understand the gravity of this evidence, consider the baseline metric. This is a condition that typically affects less than 1 in 100,000 people. The sudden density of these cases in a small, rural demographic was an epidemiological paradox. When local physicians failed to find a standard etiology, epidemiologists from the Yale School of Medicine were dispatched to investigate the anomaly. They began building a geographical profile of the victims, plotting the addresses on a localized map. The data revealed a stark pattern. The cases were not distributed evenly, but were heavily concentrated in the densely wooded areas bordering the town boundaries. The witness testimonies provided the next crucial piece of evidence. The victims uniformly reported a strange, expanding red rash appearing on their skin prior to the onset of severe joint pain and cascading neurological symptoms. They described the lesion as resembling a distinct bullseye. This was a physical signature, a biological fingerprint left at the scene of the crime, indicating a specific point of inoculation by an external vector. We subjected this cluster to rigorous statistical modeling. The mathematical probability of this specific symptom profile occurring naturally, simultaneously, and in such a restrictive geographical radius was calculated to be practically zero. Nature does not operate with such abrupt, localized symmetry. This data did not indicate a slow evolutionary spread. It indicated a singular, explosive event. The evidence was pointing away from a natural occurrence and toward an active epicenter. The investigators had to identify the delivery mechanism. If the pathogen was the bullet, they needed the gun. Field research in the surrounding woods isolated the culprit. The vector of transmission was positively identified as the Ixodes scapularis, commonly known as the deer tick. Yet, discovering the biological transport system only deepened the mystery. Ticks are territorial, slow-moving parasites. They do not spontaneously generate unprecedented disease outbreaks on their own. As we review the autopsy of this outbreak, the timeline becomes the most damning piece of the puzzle. Pathogens require centuries to establish an equilibrium within an ecosystem. You do not see a pristine environment suddenly erupt with a highly evolved, multi-systemic bacterial infection without an external catalyst. The paper trail from the Yale archives proves that the researchers were treating the symptom, but entirely missing the motive and the true origin of the catalyst. Let us examine the alibi of the local ecosystem. The prevailing narrative suggests that the deer population simply swelled, bringing the ticks into suburban backyards. But this alibi falls apart under cross-examination. Deer populations had fluctuated for decades across the entire eastern seaboard without triggering a localized epidemic of crippling arthritis. The presence of the deer tick was merely a prerequisite, not the ignition source for this concentrated biological fire. We must follow the coordinates of the anomaly. The town of Lyme was simply ground zero for the human casualties, the place where the biological intrusion finally crossed the threshold into the medical record. But a forensic reconstruction requires us to look beyond the immediate victims. We have to map the exact trajectory of the vector, tracing the infection backward from the suburban lawns to the deep woods, and eventually to the very edge of the Atlantic coastline. Every major investigation pivots on a single, irreconcilable fact that forces you to discard the official narrative. For us, it is the sheer mathematical density of the initial contagion. We are not looking at a gradual, natural migration of a microscopic threat. We are looking at a localized saturation event. The geographical profile of the Connecticut outbreak resembles a chemical spill more than it does a traditional, naturally occurring biological dispersion. Here is the statistical impossibility that shatters the natural origin theory. We have exactly 39 cases of an exceedingly rare, debilitating juvenile arthritis manifesting simultaneously in a town of just 8,000 people. It is a cluster anomaly that breaks all known epidemiological models. To understand what truly happened in the summer of 1975, we must look across the water to the classified offshore facility where the paper trail goes completely dark. Having established the epicenter in Lyme, we track the geographical coordinates precisely south across the Sound to the nearest landmass. You feel the cold spray of Long Island Sound as the boat cuts through dark, choppy water. The mainland fades behind you. Ahead, wrapped in a paranoid isolation of rusted barbed wire and imposing concrete structures, lies a territory the government tried to erase from the public consciousness. We are following the mathematical anomaly to its physical source. In any forensic investigation, geographical proximity is the first piece of circumstantial evidence. If you take a map of the 1975 outbreak and draw a straight line from the absolute highest density of tick bites, it creates a damning vector. That line points directly across a narrow stretch of water, terminating at an island heavily guarded by federal patrol boats. This is not a coincidence. It is an undeniable geographical pointer to a crime scene hidden in plain sight. Exactly 2.5 miles off the coast of the Connecticut outbreak zone sits Plum Island. It is an 840-acre spit of land isolated by treacherous currents and a veil of absolute federal secrecy. To the casual observer on the mainland shoreline, it is just a dark silhouette on the horizon. But in the architecture of the Cold War, those 2.5 miles of ocean were considered a highly classified quarantine moat, designed to keep something unseen trapped inside. To crack the alibi of this restricted zone, you have to leave the water and enter the dead silence of the National Archives. Under the sharp scent of microfiche plastic and the smell of decaying paper, the declassification archivist hunts for a slip in the bureaucracy. The official narrative is a fortress, but every fortress has a paper trail. The archivist scans through thousands of redacted procurement logs, looking for the exact moment this desolate rock was permanently militarized. The paper trail solidifies in 1954. The documents reveal that the United States Department of Agriculture officially established the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. At the heart of this new complex was a heavily fortified structure known in the architectural blueprints simply as Building 257. On paper, it was a bureaucratic triumph, a dedicated scientific outpost designed to secure the nation's agricultural future. But the official stamp hides a darker mandate. Publicly, the facility was dedicated to studying foot and mouth disease. The stated mission was to protect American livestock from foreign pathogens. It is a perfect, impenetrable alibi. Who would question a government laboratory actively working to secure the domestic food supply? For decades, this agricultural cover story successfully deflected all public scrutiny. You do not ask questions about a veterinary clinic, even one guarded by armed military police and layered in razor wire. But an investigator knows that alibis are often betrayed by their own accounting. The archivist scrutinizes the operational expenditures of Building 257. The financial footprints do not match the profile of a simple civilian agricultural lab. You see massive appropriations for specialized containment hardware, positive pressure ventilation systems, and security protocols that far exceed the requirements for studying cattle diseases. The budget is screaming an entirely different story. The breakthrough comes from a misfiled ledger on a yellowed microfiche. Declassified military budgets from the 1950s expose a massive contradiction in the public record. Building 257 was not a solo civilian venture. It was jointly operated with the United States Army Chemical Corps. The Department of Agriculture was merely the administrative front, providing a sterile civilian face for one of the most highly classified military operations of the 20th century. When the Army Chemical Corps sets up shop, the scientific vocabulary shifts from preservation to weaponization. The archivist pulls a heavily stamped dossier, the ink faded but the intent crystal clear. You are no longer looking at a facility protecting livestock. You are looking at a dark laboratory engineering biological superiority. The military did not care about sick cows. They cared about utilizing the fundamental mechanisms of disease as a strategic asset against global adversaries. The declassified operational mandate leaves no room for ambiguity. The primary directive of the Chemical Corps at this specific location was defensive biological warfare research. And their chosen vehicle of delivery was not an airborne gas, but living, breathing biology. The archives explicitly detail a hyper-focus on vector-borne pathogens. They were pouring millions of dollars into studying how insects could harbor, carry, and transmit paralyzing agents directly into the human bloodstream. Look back at the dark silhouette of Plum Island from the choppy water of the Sound. The imposing concrete structures are no longer just buildings. They are incubators for an ecological arms race. The military complex believed they could harness the chaos of nature, turning microscopic bacteria and crawling arthropods into predictable, controllable munitions. It is the ultimate scientific hubris. They trusted their steel doors and their strict protocols to contain the invisible warfare inside. The island operated under strict biosafety Level 3 protocols. Air was filtered, suits were sanitized, and the perimeter was locked down. But bureaucratic protocols cannot negotiate with the raw violence of meteorology. Situated directly in the Atlantic storm track, Plum Island was frequently battered by severe coastal storms and brutal hurricanes. Declassified damage assessments show these massive weather events repeatedly compromising the integrity of the physical containment structures. You have a military division breeding weaponized pathogens in insects, housed in a facility constantly fractured by hurricane-force winds, just 2.5 miles from the American mainland. The illusion of the quarantine moat evaporates. The archivist closes the file, the terrifying reality setting in. The leak was not a matter of if, but when. The infected vectors were bred in the dark, and all it took was one compromised roof, one shattered vent, to release the plague into the wind. The wind only scatters the ashes. It does not light the fire. The military presence on Plum Island demands a forensic audit. If Building 257 was manufacturing a biological catastrophe, you must pull the paper trail to find the architect. I need to know exactly who was designing the experiments inside those compromised concrete walls. The answer is not buried in a medical journal. It sits in a dark archive room, smelling of decaying paper and the sharp scent of microfiche plastic. To the declassification archivist, the anomaly is glaring. You see, a military apparatus does not spontaneously invent entomological warfare overnight. They imported the blueprint. Under the cold glare of the light table, the brittle, yellowed pages of a 1949 personnel dossier reveal the foundation of the operation. Following the end of the Second World War, the United States intelligence apparatus executed a classified initiative known as Operation Paperclip. They systematically recruited hundreds of former Nazi scientists. They were not just taking rocket engineers and physicists. The archivist's gloved hand smooths out a heavy, ink-stamped document bearing a specific name: Dr. Eric Traub. The file lists his credentials as an entomologist and a virologist. More importantly, it lists his previous employer. Traub was the chief biological weapons expert for the Third Reich. He answered directly to Heinrich Himmler. While other scientists were building explosives, Traub was engineering living plagues. The archive yields horrific photographs of his wartime laboratory protocols. During the war, he bypassed traditional delivery systems. Traub experimented extensively with weaponizing ticks to carry deadly bacterial payloads. The evidence is laid out under the magnifying glass. Photographs of World War II-era aerial drop canisters demonstrate the delivery mechanism. Traub's operational protocol involved packing these modified munitions with infected arthropods and intentionally dropping them from aircraft over the Soviet Union. He turned the sky into a biological weapon. The paper trail shows that morality was simply redacted for strategic advantage. In 1949, the intelligence community secretly brought Eric Traub into the United States. He was not a prisoner of war. He was a highly valued asset. The dossier confirms he consulted directly with the military command tasked with establishing the Plum Island facility. The architect of Himmler's insect warfare program was given a blank slate on American soil. I tracked the memos flowing between the Pentagon and the island. The military wanted to replicate his Soviet drop experiments. They needed an architect who understood how to turn a microscopic parasite into an unpredictable, self-replicating munition. The evidence transitions from consultation to active deployment. Declassified memorandums from the Joint Chiefs of Staff confirm the terrifying authorization. The highest levels of the military command approved a classified project to mass breed ticks directly at the Plum Island facility. The documents specifically mandate the cultivation of the Lone Star tick. This was not a small-scale laboratory test. The procurement orders detail the construction of an industrial breeding apparatus. They were cultivating hundreds of thousands of blood-feeding parasites within the storm-battered walls of Building 257. Looking at the supply manifests, I see the math clearly. They were manufacturing a biological stockpile. The strategic objective documented in the archives is classified under a sterile, bureaucratic term: vector denial. The concept is brutal and mathematically cold. The goal was to create an insect population so densely saturated with a debilitating pathogen that enemy troops could not survive or even enter the targeted environment. Vector denial operates exactly like a living minefield. You do not need to shoot the enemy if you can paralyze their infantry with an invisible, crawling army. Traub's blueprint was designed to render entire geographical regions completely uninhabitable through biological contamination. It is a scorched earth tactic, executed by parasites. The archivist turns off the light table, the darkness closing in around the World War II canisters and the Joint Chiefs' memorandums. The motive and the method are locked in the chain of evidence. The United States military handed a Nazi bioweapons expert the keys to an island just off the Connecticut coast and told him to breed a plague. The United States military handed a Nazi bioweapons expert an island and an insect army. But a delivery system is useless without a payload. We have the facility, we have the vector. But to understand the crime, I need to identify the specific biological agent, the exact microscopic weapon that caused the Connecticut outbreak. I step into the glaring white lights of a biosafety Level 3 laboratory, the hum of positive pressure ventilation drowning out the world outside. The air in here is filtered, sterile, dead. On the stainless steel necropsy table rests an electron microscope, my only window into the scene of the crime. For years following the 1975 anomaly, the actual cause of the juvenile arthritis remained an absolute medical mystery. Civilian doctors were treating ghosts, prescribing antibiotics and painkillers to an adversary they could not see or isolate in a standard blood test. As an investigator tracking an epidemic, you learn to look for the signature of the killer. I adjust the ocular lens, dialing in the magnification. The field of view snaps into sharp focus. I am not looking for a virus. Viruses hijack cells in a predictable raid. I am hunting for something far more complex. A pathogen that evades the immune system with terrifying efficiency. The medical establishment was baffled because they were looking for a common infection, not a sophisticated infiltrator. It was not until 1981 that a medical entomologist finally broke the case. His name was Willy Burgdorfer. Under a lens much like this one, he identified the elusive culprit, a corkscrew-shaped spirochete bacterium. It was a predatory, aggressive organism, later named Borrelia burgdorferi in his honor. Through the lens, I watch these spirals aggressively corkscrewing through a blood sample. The medical community hailed Burgdorfer as a hero. the solitary genius who solved the Connecticut puzzle. But in forensic epidemiology, you never just look at the pathogen. You audit the discoverer. I pull the declassified employment protocols. The narrative of the humble civilian scientist immediately falls apart. The man who discovered the cause of Lyme disease in 1981 was himself a former biological weapons researcher. The official biography provided to the public was heavily sanitized, an alibi printed on government letterhead. Bergdorfer worked for decades at the Rocky Mountain Laboratory in Montana. On paper, it was a standard public health research facility. In reality, the archives expose a massive shadow budget and a deeply hidden paper trail. The Rocky Mountain Laboratory maintained deep, classified ties directly to the United States Department of Defense. This was not a civilian outpost. It was a black site for entomological warfare. During the 1950s and 1960s, Bergdorfer was officially contracted by the military. His primary directive was not to cure diseases, but to manufacture them. His lab notebooks detail the intentional infection of ticks with various highly virulent pathogens, including experimental viruses and weaponized bacteria designed to incapacitate. I traced the paper trail of his supply requisitions. Bergdorfer was systematically testing the viability of these infected arthropods as deployable bioweapons. He was determining how long a tick could survive with a lethal payload, how effectively it could transmit the bacteria to a mammalian host, and how quickly the infection would spread through a population. He was the chief engineer of the microscopic delivery mechanism. The transaction record is damning. The corkscrew-shaped spirochete he miraculously discovered in the civilian population in the 1980s was not a stranger to him. It belonged to a specific family of bacteria he had intimately studied, cultivated, and manipulated during his classified military service. He did not just find the killer. He had spent 2 decades working alongside it in a government laboratory. Bergdorfer knew exactly what he was looking for in 1981 because he had helped build the arsenal. If this scale of bureaucratic deception blows your mind too, hit the like button. To not miss the final solution to this biological mystery, subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, do you think a scientist can maintain their ethics while engineering a plague for the state? Or does the secrecy corrupt the science? The glaring white lights of the necropsy room feel colder now. The Borrelia burgdorferi pathogen is no longer just a random mutation of nature. It is a suspect with a heavily redacted dossier. When a biological weapons contractor is the only person who can identify a mysterious new civilian pathogen, the burden of proof shifts. This is no longer a public health investigation. It is a crime scene reconstruction. I stare back down the ocular lens. The spirochete's movement is unnatural, almost mechanical in its precision. It drills through tissue, hiding deep within the joints and the nervous system, perfectly evolved to cause maximum chronic debilitation rather than immediate death. In military terms, a dead enemy is a tragedy, but a chronically ill enemy drains logistics, medical supplies, and morale. It is the perfect, invisible weapon. The timeline is the ultimate alibi that fails under scrutiny. Bergdorfer manipulates spirochetes in the 1950s and 60s. The unexplained outbreak erupts in 1975, a mere 2.5 miles from the military's primary tick breeding facility. Then, the military contractor arrives on the scene to officially name the disease, sealing the narrative. The loop is closed, and the origin is buried in paperwork. We have the corpse, an epidemic of juvenile arthritis that shattered a Connecticut community. We have the murder weapon, a highly aggressive, evasive bacterial pathogen. And now we have the beneficiary, a defense apparatus that required real-world data on vector-borne disease transmission. The scientific literature recorded a triumph of public health, while the classified archives recorded a successful, though perhaps accidental, field test. But identifying the engineer and the payload still leaves one critical gap in the protocol. I step away from the microscope, the hum of the laboratory ventilation a constant reminder of containment. If the military cultivated these infected vectors on an isolated island, guarded by deep ocean currents, the infection should have remained quarantined. A wingless insect cannot swim. The pathogen needed a smuggler to breach the perimeter. If the infected ticks were bred on Plum Island, we face a locked-room mystery of continental proportions. How does a wingless crawling arachnid traverse 2.5 miles of violent ocean currents to establish a bridgehead on the Connecticut coastline? The answer lies in a fatal blind spot of military logistics. You cannot understand the spread of this pathogen by looking at the water. You have to look up. In the paranoia of the Cold War, the defense apparatus obsessed over naval blockades and submarine nets. They looked at the churning waters of Long Island Sound and declared Plum Island an impenetrable fortress, an absolute quarantine moat. They built electrified fences to keep Soviet spies out, but you cannot build a wall against the sky. The island's perfect isolation was an illusion, violently shattered by millions of wings. I project the animated satellite data onto the screen, letting the glowing lines strip away the water to reveal the cold, hard geography. The military brass selected Plum Island precisely for its aquatic isolation, operating under the assumption that deep ocean currents provided a flawless biocontainment barrier. It was a catastrophic failure in basic ecological intelligence. They stared intently at the ocean, completely ignoring the active airspace right above it. The architects of Building 257 were chemists and weaponized entomologists, not ornithologists. They calculated the swimming capabilities of local fauna, meticulously logging the inability of deer or rodents to survive the crossing. They believed their open-air tick experiments were safely confined to an 840-acre sandbox. But an ecosystem is a dynamic, overlapping grid, not a static, two-dimensional map on a general's desk. Look closely at the migratory patterns overlaying the East Coast. Plum Island does not just sit in the water, it sits directly beneath the Atlantic Flyway. This is one of the most heavily trafficked avian migration routes on the planet, a massive, invisible superhighway pumping biological life from South America all the way up to the Canadian Arctic. The military built a biological laboratory directly under a global transit hub. Every spring and fall, a staggering biological transit occurs. Millions of migratory birds, thrushes, robins, sparrows, follow the ancient magnetic pull of the Earth. Exhausted from hundreds of miles of continuous flight over open ocean, they desperately require a staging ground. Plum Island, with its dense, untouched coastal brush, acts as the perfect, inevitable rest stop before they make the final, critical leap to the Connecticut mainland. Now, zoom in on the biomechanics of our primary suspect. Ticks are not sprinters. They are ambush predators and exceptional hitchhikers. A larval Ixodes scapularis does not need to cross the ocean itself. It only needs to climb to the top of a blade of grass, extend its forelegs, and wait for a feathered transport to land in the brush. The insect does the waiting, and the ecosystem does the heavy lifting. Once a bird lands in the contaminated brush of Plum Island to forage, the physical connection is made. The larval tick latches onto the host, burying its mouthparts deep beneath the protective feathers. It does not kill the transport. Instead, it securely anchors itself to feed on the avian blood for several days, gorging quietly while the exhausted bird regains its strength for the next leg of the journey north. The military's 2.5-mile water barrier suddenly becomes utterly irrelevant. The host bird takes off, carrying the engorged, infected parasite into the sky. The trip across Long Island Sound takes mere minutes by air. The pathogen, incubated in a classified, government-funded laboratory, is now airborne, effortlessly bypassing every barbed wire fence and security checkpoint the federal defense budget could buy. The bird lands in the wealthy wooded suburbs of Lyme, Connecticut. The tick, having finished its required blood meal, simply drops off into the leaf litter. It molts, entering its next life stage, ready to seek a new mammalian host, a deer, a family dog, or a child playing in the backyard. The military had inadvertently placed their weaponized outdoor test site directly in the center of an international biological highway. This is not a single, isolated breach. It is an industrialized conveyor belt of infection. During the 1950s and 60s, thousands of birds touched down on Plum Island during each migration cycle. If even a fraction of a percent carried infected ticks to the mainland, the mathematical compounding becomes terrifying. It is an algorithmic expansion of a biological threat, deployed entirely by the mechanics of nature. As an investigator reviewing these declassified protocols, the sheer bureaucratic negligence is staggering. The classified logs detail the deliberate introduction of the Borrelia pathogen into local tick populations on the island. Yet I find absolutely no evidence of a single risk assessment regarding avian transport. They engineered the ultimate biological weapon, handed it to millions of untraceable couriers, and looked the other way. The statistics from the resulting fallout serve as a permanent indictment. Today, we track over 400,000 new human infections annually across the United States. A staggering 90% of these cases are geographically concentrated in the Northeast and Upper Midwest. This localized explosion did not emerge from a vacuum. It radiated outward from a precise ground zero, carried on the wings of an unmonitored ecological network. The locked room mystery is officially solved. The island was never a secure quarantine zone. It was an active launch pad. The ecosystem itself was hijacked, turning a natural avian migration into a hostile biological delivery system. The authorities blamed a random act of nature, but the geographical heat map tells a damning story of a localized military experiment that broke containment through sheer, arrogant oversight. The mainland was fatally compromised, and the pathogen quickly established its dark dominion in the forests of New England. But to understand why this specific strain of bacteria proved so devastating, so chronically destructive to the human immune system, we must look closer at the microscopic payload itself. We must open Willy Bergdorfer's private, unpublished journals to see exactly what else he unleashed into the wild. With the transmission route established, my investigation pivots from the sky back to the pathogen itself. We must examine the biological anomalies that make this disease so uniquely destructive. The trail leads me to a dimly lit, cluttered office where a single shaft of light illuminates a stack of personal journals. Dust motes dance above the brittle pages as my gloved hands carefully open the private, unpublished files of Willy Bergdorfer. You are told the story of a medical hero, a brilliant entomologist who solved the Lyme mystery in 1981. The official record is a sanitized alibi. The truth, buried in the cursive script of these fading notebooks, reads like a deathbed confession. Discovered documents reveal that the man who named the disease took a devastating, highly classified secret to his grave. The official narrative of this epidemic is deliberately incomplete. For decades, the true scope of the biological payload remained locked away. It was not until 2013, years after Bergdorfer's death, that researchers finally breached his personal archive. As an archivist hunting for the missing link, scanning these unredacted laboratory records feels like finding a murder weapon hidden in plain sight. These are not the polished reports submitted to medical journals. These are the raw, unfiltered data points of a military contractor. The paperwork exposes a glaring, intentional omission in his official 1981 report to the global scientific community. When Bergdorfer analyzed the ticks pulled from the Connecticut epicenter, he did not just find the Borrelia spirochete. His private notes document a concurrent, far more aggressive biological agent. The public health sector was handed half a truth, while a far more dangerous variable was quietly erased from the medical protocols. In the forensic analysis of a cover-up, the absence of data is often the loudest evidence. Why would a celebrated scientist intentionally suppress a major discovery? You look at the heavy black ink underlining specific entries in his ledger. The motive is not scientific oversight. It is operational security. The anomaly in the pathogen profile directly compromised the military's deniability regarding their open-air entomological testing on Plum Island. The unredacted microscopic analysis reveals that Bergdorfer discovered not one, but two distinct pathogens coexisting within the ticks from the Lyme epicenter. The second was a highly virulent strain of Rickettsia, a notoriously aggressive bacteria known to trigger severe, debilitating spotted fevers. This was not a simple bacterial infection. It was a dual-threat biological package, perfectly designed to overwhelm a human immune system simultaneously on multiple fronts. The archivist's magnifying glass hovers over a recurring phrase in the margins of the 1979 notebooks. Bergdorfer did not use the standard taxonomic classification for this second, suppressed pathogen. Instead, he repeatedly referred to it using a cryptic operational alias, the Swiss agent. It is a forensic paper trail, a private code word for a bacterial weapon he was intimately familiar with from his classified days at the Rocky Mountain Laboratory. The implications of the Swiss agent destroy the entire foundation of modern Lyme disease treatment. When you are infected with Borrelia, your immune system mounts a defense. But when Rickettsia is introduced simultaneously, it acts as a biological saboteur, compromising the cellular walls and allowing the primary pathogen to dig deeper into neurological tissue. The military knew exactly how this synergistic cocktail operated, yet they let civilian doctors fight completely blind. The silence was not voluntary. It was enforced by the chain of command. Audio interviews conducted shortly before Bergdorfer passed away suggest a dark, bureaucratic reality. The military apparatus heavily pressured him to omit the Swiss agent from his public findings. Acknowledging a weaponized strain of Rickettsia in the Connecticut suburbs would have immediately triggered a federal investigation into the Department of Defense and their offshore vector programs. This is the bureaucracy of betrayal. A few redacted lines in a government report doomed hundreds of thousands of people to a lifetime of misdiagnosis. By suppressing the existence of the Swiss agent, the intelligence community ensured that the medical establishment would only test for and treat a single bacteria. The official protocol became a band-aid applied to a gaping, infected wound. The alibi held, but the collateral damage was entirely absorbed by the American public. This classified omission perfectly explains the most agonizing mystery of the modern epidemic. It answers why so many Lyme patients suffer from chronic, severe neurological symptoms that simply do not respond to standard, short-term antibiotic treatments for Borrelia alone. You are not just fighting a rogue spirochete. You are fighting an undeclared, multi-pathogen cocktail that was engineered to resist conventional eradication. The doctors have been treating the wrong crime scene.
The investigator closes the journal. The dust settles in the beam of light. But the reality of the deception remains glaringly obvious. The military-industrial complex compromised public health to protect a classified asset. We now possess the paper trail, the motive, and the suppressed biological blueprint of the outbreak. But to definitively lock this case, we need an objective witness that cannot be silenced, pressured, or classified by a government agency.
We must bypass the compromised human element entirely and interrogate the raw code of the biosphere. To prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this dual pathogen cocktail was synthetically amplified by the military, we must turn to the irrefutable mathematics of modern DNA sequencing. The final piece of evidence is not written in ink on decaying paper, but encoded in the genetic memory of the arthropods themselves, waiting 70 years in the dark to tell the truth. To definitively isolate the true origin of this biowarfare cocktail, the forensic epidemiologist steps away from the dusty archives and into the glaring, sterile light of a positive-pressure genomics laboratory. The paper trail ends here. Now, the relentless hum of an automated sequencer replaces the heavy silence of the reading room, methodically mapping out billions of base pairs across a glowing monitor to interrogate the biological code directly. The monitor displays the genetic code of an Ixodes tick collected in 1945, juxtaposed against a specimen from the 1980 outbreak. The investigator is hunting for a molecular timestamp. In 2017, genomic researchers conducted a groundbreaking paleogenetic analysis on these preserved arthropods, extracting degraded DNA from 70-year-old museum archives to establish a definitive baseline. The resulting data stream forces a radical reassessment of the entire case file. The sequencing confirms a crucial fact. The Borrelia burgdorferi bacterium existed in North America long before the concrete foundation of the Plum Island facility was ever poured. To the untrained eye, this looks like an airtight alibi. It seems to suggest that the military is innocent, and the pathogen was simply a natural resident of the Connecticut woods.
But DNA does not lie, and a forensic epidemiologist knows how to read the spaces between the genes.
This ancient biological footprint does not exonerate the biowarfare program. It completely changes the nature of the crime. The paleogenetic truth reveals that the Department of Defense did not need to invent the gun. They simply found an existing, highly effective weapon in the dirt and decided to manufacture billions of biological bullets.
The genetic data provides a crystal-clear picture of the ecosystem prior to the 1970s.
For centuries, the Borrelia bacteria existed in an extremely low-density, localized equilibrium. It was incredibly rare, isolated in small pockets of the wild, kept in check by the harsh mathematical limits of natural selection. The probability of a human encountering an infected tick was statistically negligible.
Suddenly, a genetic mismatch flashes red across the sequencer's monitor. The anomaly is glaring.
The transition from the 1945 baseline to the 1970s outbreak does not show a slow evolutionary drift. It shows a vertical spike, a violent biological explosion that defies every established model of natural propagation. A pathogen does not spontaneously conquer a continent without a massive logistical catalyst.
The military did not need to genetically engineer a synthetic bacteria from scratch in a test tube. They achieved their goal through brute force logistics. By mass breeding hundreds of thousands of ticks inside Building 257, artificially infecting them with the native spirochete, and conducting open-air tests, they acted as a catastrophic, localized amplifier. Inside those positive pressure rooms, the natural limits of the food chain were entirely removed. The arthropods were fed, incubated, and saturated with the pathogen in a highly controlled, weaponized environment. The researchers took an organism that nature had kept suppressed and forced it into an unnatural state of hyperproliferation. They built a biological factory specifically designed to maximize the density of the vector. Through the cold, calculating lens of the epidemiologist, the mechanism of the disaster is finally exposed. The scientists on Plum Island took a smoldering, naturally occurring biological ember and poured military-grade aviation fuel directly onto it. This orchestrated saturation created an entirely unnatural vector density, overloading the local ecosystem with an astronomical concentration of infected parasites. When the physical containment of the laboratory failed, and the migratory birds carried those hyper-infected larvae across the 2.5-mile stretch of water, the result was immediate. The localized equilibrium was shattered instantly. The weaponized arthropods dropped into the affluent, unsuspecting suburbs of Connecticut, initiating an explosive chain reaction that the local medical infrastructure was completely blind to. This is the critical distinction between discovering a disease and engineering an epidemic. The crime was not the creation of the Borrelia spirochete. The crime was the deliberate amplification of its delivery system. When you walk through the woods today, you are not stepping into a pristine, natural environment. You are walking through the fallout zone of a Cold War entomological experiment that treated the biosphere as a disposable petri dish. The genetic sequencer finishes its run, the red anomalies permanently logged into the system. The data is unassailable. The paleogenetic record proves that the unprecedented 1975 outbreak was a mathematically impossible event without the direct intervention of an industrial-scale breeding program. The military effectively hijacked the evolutionary trajectory of an entire species to serve a classified agenda. The investigator extracts the digital drive from the console. The origin of the disease is no longer a shadow in the archives. It is a sequenced mathematical certainty. The defense apparatus took a rare, isolated pathogen and transformed it into an aggressive, continent-spanning plague. The laboratory origin is confirmed not by a leaked memo, but by the irrefutable, mutated bloodline of the insect itself. The screen goes dark in the genetics lab, but the data remains illuminated in our minds. I have reviewed the paleogenetic sequences, the declassified memorandums, the operational blueprints of Building 257. The forensic reconstruction is complete, and the verdict is irrefutable. We are no longer looking at a spontaneous medical anomaly. We are staring at the architectural plans of a catastrophe. Step outside the laboratory and watch the Connecticut woods over the last 50 years. You see the suburban sprawl pushing deeper into the tree line, families building homes in what they believe is pristine nature. But this environment was compromised long before the foundations were poured. The ecosystem itself was treated as an open-air testing ground for an entomological weapon. This was not a weapon deployed over foreign soil. This was the collateral damage of a shadow war driven by sheer hubris. The military-industrial complex believed they could command the biosphere, mass-breeding parasites on a quarantined island while ignoring the birds passing directly overhead.
They manufactured an unnaturally dense population of infected vectors, and gravity simply took its course. The original mission parameters defined on Plum Island aimed for vector denial against a hypothetical enemy. Instead, that classified objective triggered a perpetual, undeclared war against the American public. A localized biological experiment, amplified by the infrastructure of the state, was allowed to bleed into the civilian population. The target was never the citizens, but the casualties are exclusively ours.
Today, that crimson stain on the epidemiological map has consumed the continent. The Ixodes scapularis ticks, harboring the weaponized concentration of the Borrelia pathogen, have now been documented in all 50 states. We are no longer tracking a localized outbreak in a small coastal town. We are documenting the irreversible contamination of the North American biosphere. Because of Willy Bergdorfer's coerced silence, millions of patients have spent decades fighting a ghost. They were told they had a simple bacterial infection, while their bodies were actually besieged by a multi-pathogen cocktail. The suppression of the Swiss agent and other co-infections turned a manageable medical condition into a chronic, debilitating sentence for over 400,000 people every single year. The true tragedy of the Lyme epidemic is not just the biological mutation. It is the bureaucracy of secrecy that protected it. The United States government has never officially admitted to an accidental release from Building 257. The redactions remain in place, shielding the architects of this disaster from accountability, while civilian doctors are left operating with intentionally incomplete medical intelligence. This is how an empire poisons its own well. You compile the geographical coordinates pointing straight to Plum Island. You factor in the recruitment of Nazi biological warfare experts under Operation Paperclip. You layer the genomic proof of sudden, unnatural amplification. The case file leaves no room for coincidence. The epidemic was an engineered inevitability, masked by 50 years of institutional denial. We trust the natural world because we assume its dangers are evolved, governed by the slow logic of Darwinian selection. But when state-sponsored science bypasses evolution to manufacture a crisis, it hacks the very contract we have with nature. We did not inherit this plague from the deep past. We funded it, we bred it behind barbed wire, and we allowed it to fly over the water on the wings of a careless arrogance. This investigation forces a fundamental reassessment of every walk in the woods, every hike through the brush. You are walking through a crime scene where the evidence is actively crawling up your leg. Ignorance of this history is no longer a defense. Understanding the origin of the Lyme pathogen is the only way to demand accurate diagnostics from a medical establishment that is still largely blind to the military history of the disease. I set out to reconstruct a chain of custody, to track a microscopic assassin from a classified laboratory to the American backyard. The evidence is now documented. The geographical, historical, and genetic vectors converge on a single, undeniable point of origin. The narrative of a spontaneous natural outbreak has been entirely dismantled. The dossier on patient 0 is officially complete, and the historical alibi is broken. We look to the future, fearing artificial intelligence or nuclear winter. Yet we fail to recognize that the biological fallout of the Cold War is already coursing through our veins. The ecosystem is no longer wild. It is a ledger of our past scientific transgressions. The organisms in the soil and the ticks in the grass carry the unredacted legacy of the 20th century's darkest ambitions. If assembling this evidence has fundamentally shifted your understanding of the ground you walk on, hit the like button. That resonance tells us this investigation matters.
and to continue tearing down the classified barriers surrounding our public health. Subscribe to this channel. We are building an open-source archive of truth, and your participation is the only countermeasure against the bureaucracy of silence. The canopy of the forest reflects in your eye, no longer a symbol of untouched wilderness, but a monument to a covert catastrophe. The truth is out there, embedded in the genetic code of the parasites waiting in the brush. We have exposed the architects, but we are the ones left navigating the fallout. The case of the Plum Island biological breach is closed, but the infection remains. I am the lead investigator, signing off.